Welcome to the DX Today podcast, where you get facts and no hype.
And we have a lot of facts to get through today, a truly staggering amount.
We really do, because today is Saturday, February 28th, 2026.
Right.
And if you're listening to this, you are living through a day that has just fundamentally shifted the entire tech and defense landscape. It's a massive realignment.
It's a seismic event, and that's exactly why we're dedicating this entire deep dive to unpacking it. We are looking at a document titled The Line in the Silicon.
Yeah, written by Rick Spare.
Exactly. And for those of you who might not know, Spare is the chief AI officer at AIXF and the CEO of DX Today.
Which means he knows what he's talking about.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the man has 30 years of experience in this space. We're talking about someone who has overseen something like $1.2 billion in AI enterprise solutions.
Right, so this isn't just, some academic theory.
No, not at all. It's grounded in the actual reality of deploying these massive systems.
Mm-hmm.
And his text outlines what is arguably the most consequential standoff in AI history.
The standoff between Anthropic and the Pentagon.
That's the one.
But before we get into the weeds on this, and we are going to get deep into the weeds, I want to set a very clear boundary for you, the listener.
Yes, this is crucial.
The source material we're covering today obviously involves the Trump administration, the Department of Defense, and some very heavy political actions.
Very heavy.
But our goal here today is strictly analytical. We are completely impartial. We are not taking any political sides, left or right.
Right. We are not endorsing the governmental directives.
Yeah.
And we're not advocating for the tech companies or the author's specific viewpoints.
We are just here to break down the architecture of this conflict, the factual, the technical, and the philosophical arguments exactly as Spare lays them out.
So with that impartiality clear, let's look at the actual news of the day, the inciting incident.
The big shockwave. So the Trump administration officially ordered all federal agencies to completely stop using Anthropic's technology.
Just a total hard stop.
Yeah, and the DoD went a step further. They labeled Anthropic, which, keep in mind, is a $380 billion company.
Right.
They labeled them a quote-unquote supply chain risk.
What's fascinating here is what didn't happen.
Right.
Because usually when you hear supply chain risk, you think, malicious code. Or foreign espionage, or some massive data breach.
Somebody hacked the mainframe.
Exactly. But none of that happened. This wasn't a hack. This was entirely a matter of principle.
Anthropic drew a line.
They absolutely did. They refused to drop two specific guardrails from their terms of service. First, no fully autonomous weapons, and second, no mass domestic surveillance.
And Dario Amodei, the CEO, flat out said they could not in good conscience comply with the government's demand to strip those safeguards.
And because of that conscience, they just lost a $200 million contract and basically their entire relationship with the U.S. government.
Which brings us to the immediate aftermath, because the irony of what happened next is just, it's off the charts.
It really is the core irony of Spare's whole analysis.
So, Anthropic is out, they lose the deal. The government still needs a vendor, right? So OpenAI immediately steps in and signs a replacement deal with the DoD.
They swoop right in.
But here is the kicker. OpenAI included the exact same safeguards that Anthropic just got fired for demanding.
The exact same ones. No mass surveillance and strict limits on lethal force.
And Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, didn't just quietly slip it into the contract. He actually told the DoD that they need to extend these terms to everyone in the industry.
So you really have to stop and think about what this reveals.
It's wild.
The DoD kicks Anthropic out for demanding ethical constraints and then immediately accepts those identical constraints from OpenAI.
Which completely validates Anthropic's original position.
Exactly. It shows that this dispute was never really about the functional capabilities of the technology. It wasn't about the military suddenly needing an unrestricted AI to fight a war today.
Right, it was about leverage.
It was entirely about who gets to control the parameters of the technology. The government wanted to prove it could dictate terms to Silicon Valley.
But by accepting OpenAI's terms, they sort of prove the opposite.
They inadvertently proved that the guardrails are actually necessary.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's look at the hard technical realities behind these guardrails. Because if you're listening, you might be thinking, isn't this all just PR? Just tech companies trying to look good?
Spare argues very convincingly that it is not PR. It's an engineering reality.
So let's talk about the first guardrail. The prohibition on fully autonomous weapons. Why is this a hard engineering constraint?
It comes down to a fundamental difference in how software works. We have to look at deterministic software versus probabilistic inference.
Right, the old way versus the AI way.
Exactly. Traditional military software is deterministic. If A happens, then B happens. It's rigid. If a radar detects a specific missile signature, the automated defense system fires a specific interceptor. It's just following logic gates.
It doesn't guess.
It doesn't guess, and it doesn't try to understand the world. But frontier models like Claude or GPT or Gemini, they don't work like that. They use probabilistic inference.
They're essentially massive prediction engines.
Right. They ingest mountains of data, and then they guess what the most likely correct output is based on statistical patterns. They don't actually know what a tank or a civilian is. They just know the statistical correlation of pixels that usually represents one.
Which leads us straight to the big problem, hallucinations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because it's probabilistic, it can be wrong. And it can be completely, confidently wrong.
To put this in perspective for you, think about how this works in a normal business setting. In enterprise software, which is where Spare has spent his career, if an AI is 99.9% accurate at summarizing your emails or parsing legal contracts, that is a massive win.
It's revolutionary for a business.
Yeah, you celebrate that. Because that 0.1% error rate, a human just fixes the typo. No big deal.
But contrast that with a military context.
It's a whole different universe.
Entirely different. If you have an autonomous targeting system processing thousands of engagements an hour on a chaotic battlefield, a 0.1% error rate isn't a typo.
It's a disaster.
It's a war crime. It means dead civilians. It means friendly fire. Because the system hallucinated that a hospital was an ammo dump based on some weird statistical noise in the visual data.
And Spare also points out that these models are vulnerable to adversarial manipulation, right?
Oh, heavily. If an adversary knows you're using a probabilistic model, they can engineer visual or digital noise to intentionally trick the AI into ignoring a target or misclassifying a threat.
So putting this in charge of lethal force without a human is mathematically guaranteed to fail catastrophically.
It is a measurable engineering risk, not a philosophical hypothetical.
Which makes the Pentagon's reaction so strange, because they actually have their own policy on this.
Yes, DoD Directive 3000.09.
Right. And what does that directive actually say?
It explicitly requires human judgment in the loop for autonomous weapon systems. The Pentagon's own written policy says you need a human making the final call to prevent unintended engagement.
So Anthropic was literally just saying, hey, we agree with your own rulebook. Our tech isn't ready to break your own rule.
Exactly. In fact, Spare notes that Anthropic actually offered to do collaborative research and development with the DoD to try and improve the safety and reliability of these models for those exact high-stakes environments.
And the DoD just rebuffed them.
Completely rebuffed them and labeled them a risk. Which, again, proves that the resistance from the Pentagon was political, not scientific. They didn't want the tech company setting the boundary, even if the boundary matched their own doctrine.
It's all about control. So let's pivot to the second guardrail, which is just as intense: mass domestic surveillance.
This is where it gets very close to home for the average citizen.
Totally. How does AI actually change the game here? Because the government already spies on people, right?
Well, currently, the government legally purchases massive amounts of data from commercial data brokers. And this is a bipartisan concern, by the way.
Right. Both sides of the aisle are worried about this.
They are. The government buys your location data, your browsing habits, your social media metadata. But right now, it's fragmented.
It's just millions of random data points.
Exactly. It requires a human analyst to sift through it, connect the dots, and figure out what it means. That friction limits how much they can actually surveil at scale.
But when you apply a frontier AI model to that ocean of data,
the friction disappears completely.
It's no longer just data collection.
It becomes an automated, omniscient behavioral prediction machine. The AI doesn't just read the data. It synthesizes it instantly. It correlates a change in your commute time with a specific web search and instantly infers a medical condition, a political affiliation, or a future action.
For millions of people simultaneously.
Simultaneously, without breaking a sweat.
If you're wondering how this affects your data, it means your digital exhaust just became a crystal ball for the state.
And Spare connects the dots here beautifully. He argues that this capability completely outpaces the framers of the Fourth Amendment.
The founding fathers definitely didn't see Claude coming.
They wrote the Fourth Amendment to protect against physical searches by agents of the state. They never conceived of a machine that could infer your entire life's secrets just from the ambient digital metadata you leave behind when you buy coffee.
So the AI creates this massive gap. There is what is technically legally allowed right now, buying data, and what is ethically defensible when you supercharge that data with AI.
And Anthropic refused to be the engine that powers that panopticon.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because when you look at both of these guardrails, it forces us to ask a deeply philosophical question.
The core question of the text: who owns the conscience of a machine?
Right. Think about a traditional weapon, like a rifle.
A rifle is a deterministic tool. The manufacturer makes the metal and the springs, but the moral weight of firing that rifle rests entirely on the human soldier pulling the trigger and the commander who gave the order.
The conscience is human.
Exactly. But a probabilistic AI is not a static tool. It participates in the cognitive process of selecting the target or analyzing the citizen. It makes statistical inferences that can be flawed.
So if the AI hallucinates and kills a civilian, is the company that wrote the statistical weights responsible?
Spare brings in some very heavy philosophical artillery to address this. He talks about Aristotle and the concept of phronesis.
Practical wisdom.
Right. Phronesis is the ability to weigh the consequences of an action in the real world. Spare argues that AI companies have an ethical imperative to exercise practical wisdom. They know their probabilistic models have flaws, so they cannot ethically hand them over for lethal or surveillance use and just wash their hands of the consequences.
They can't just say, well, we just provided the software.
No, because the software is making pseudo-cognitive choices. The text also brings in the Kantian imperative.
Immanuel Kant.
Yes, Kant argued that you must never treat human beings merely as a means to an end.
And automated mass surveillance totally violates that.
Absolutely. When an AI boils your entire life down to a predictive risk score for the government to monitor, it is treating you entirely as a data profile, a means to an end for state security. It strips away your human dignity.
Okay, but we have to present the Pentagon's moral counterargument fairly here, because they aren't just cartoon villains in this scenario.
Not at all. Both sides have valid moral weight.
The Pentagon's argument is rooted in democracy.
Exactly. In a democratic republic, the military is governed by the Constitution and elected civilian leaders. They have a sovereign mandate to defend the nation.
So from their perspective, the idea that an unelected tech CEO in Silicon Valley gets to dictate the operational rules of engagement for the U.S. military.
Through a corporate terms of service agreement, no less.
Right. They see that as profoundly undemocratic. The military says, we follow the laws of armed conflict, not your software license.
And you can see why the state views corporate guardrails as an infringement on their sovereign duty.
But Spare counters that with Hannah Arendt's warning. This is a crucial part of the text.
Arendt's concept of diffused responsibility. She warned about what happens in massive bureaucratic systems. When a system is so complex, nobody feels individually responsible for the final outcome.
Everyone is just doing their little job.
Right. Speer calls it the banality of technological violence.
That is a chilling phrase.
It really is. Imagine an AI executes an unlawful strike. Who is to blame? The data labeler in another country. The coder in California who tweaked the algorithm. The procurement officer at the Pentagon. The general who signed the contract. The operator watching the screen.
The moral weight just evaporates.
It evaporates into the network. It's killing without a killer. And that is a profound moral hazard.
Which ties directly into the social contract. Thinkers like Locke and Montesquieu based our entire system of government on the idea that power has to be checked.
Power must always be checked. But when the government demands unchecked use of frontier AI, they are trying to consolidate a massive new form of cognitive power without any corresponding institutional checks.
And look at how the government reacted when Anthropic tried to be that check. There's that quote from Dean Ball in the text.
The former policy advisor. He called the government's action against Anthropic, quote, attempted corporate murder, unquote.
Attempted corporate murder.
Because the state used its massive regulatory and financial power to try and destroy a company simply for exercising independent ethical judgment. It highlights the extreme danger of unchecked state power over private enterprise.
So what does this all mean? The text essentially uses this February 28th event as a stress test for the entire AI ecosystem.
A very harsh stress test.
Let's break down what this means for every player involved, starting with the AI companies themselves.
For the AI labs, the lesson is clear. Voluntary commitments are incredibly fragile.
Yeah, Anthropic tried to stand by a voluntary commitment, and they paid a massive price, $200 million, and a public branding as a security risk.
It proves that one company acting alone cannot hold the line against sovereign power. Spare argues that the industry desperately needs binding, audited, industry-wide standards. If all the major players form a unified front, the government can't just pick them off one by one.
What about the next group, governments and legislatures?
This is a glaring failure. The lack of AI legislation is a dangerous void.
Congress has basically been asleep at the wheel.
Exactly. The fact that the rules for autonomous weapons and mass surveillance are being hashed out in a contracting dispute between a tech company and the Pentagon means our democratic institutions are failing. Congress absolutely must step in and pass definitive laws.
They have to define the boundaries. Okay, what about the defense establishment itself, the Pentagon?
Spare argues that the Pentagon needs to realize that true military superiority isn't just about having the most ruthless technology. It pairs technology with ethical integrity.
Because if you demand absolute control and strip away all human oversight, what are you actually defending?
Right. You risk losing the very democratic values your military is supposed to protect. A democratic military must keep human judgment in the loop.
Then there are the investors and corporate boards, the people funding all of this.
This event completely changed their reality. AI safety used to be viewed as a soft PR issue. Make sure the chatbot doesn't say anything offensive so the brand looks good. Now, it is a hard financial risk management issue. Anthropic lost a massive revenue stream. Investors have to realize that ethical guardrails, or the lack thereof, can literally make or break a company's valuation overnight. There is a massive chilling effect now.
It's real money on the line. What about the researchers, the scientists actually building these models?
For them, technical safety like fixing hallucinations and ensuring alignment is no longer just an interesting academic puzzle.
It's a geopolitical necessity.
Exactly. If the models aren't technically reliable, the ethical debate becomes moot. The researchers have to empirically solve the probabilistic flaws before these systems are deployed in combat.
And finally, the citizens. That is you listening to this deep dive right now.
Spare makes it very clear that you cannot be a spectator.
This isn't just tech news. This shapes your democratic future. If you aren't paying attention to how your data is being fed into these models by the government, you're going to wake up in a surveillance state that you didn't vote for.
You have to hold your representatives accountable.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we really see how terrifying this precedent is. Section 6 of Spare's text zooms out to the international stage.
Right, because the rest of the world is watching what happened on February 28th very closely.
The EU, the UK, Japan, and authoritarian regimes like China.
Exactly. And the precedent the U.S. just set is dangerous. If the United States government uses its power to force American tech companies to strip away their ethical guardrails,
it essentially gives authoritarian regimes a free pass to do the exact same thing.
it completely strips America of its moral high ground. How can the U.S. criticize China for using AI in mass surveillance if the U.S. government is punishing its own companies for refusing to do it?
It's a race to the bottom.
It is. And Spare draws a really profound historical analogy here. He compares this moment to the dawn of the nuclear age.
That is a heavy comparison. Let's dig into that.
In the 1940s and 50s, the U.S. had this incredible new technology, and there were people arguing that we should use it without restraint to dominate the globe.
Just use the advantage while we have it.
Right. But wiser minds prevailed. We helped establish the Geneva Conventions. We pushed for nuclear arms control. We created guardrails.
And doing that didn't make the U.S. weak.
Exactly the opposite. Those constraints were acts of strategic wisdom. They preserved the global order. They prevented a catastrophic spiral.
And Spare is saying we need that exact same strategic wisdom right now with AI.
We cannot let the fear of falling behind in a tech race force us to abandon the ethical frameworks that keep civilization intact.
So to synthesize all of this, the core truth that Spare reveals in this document is that these guardrails on AI, they aren't just obstacles.
They are the literal architecture of a civilized future.
Anthropic stood up for that architecture, and in the short term, they lost the battle. They lost the contract.
But the line in the silicon has been drawn. The conversation is out in the open.
And the challenge now is moving those values out of the private code of a tech company and into the democratic laws of our society.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply unsettling thought to consider.
What is that?
We spent this entire time talking about a company that fought to keep its ethical guardrails. Anthropic had a conscience, but they were just one company.
Right.
Think about this as you go about your day. What happens tomorrow when the next massive, world-altering breakthrough in artificial intelligence comes from a company or a state actor that never had any of these ethical guardrails in their code to begin with?
That is the real danger, if the baseline is set by whoever cares the least about the consequences. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions about the technology that is actively shaping your world.